Good morning, afternoon and evening all. This is Yorkie with episode 2 of Old School, and you may have noticed I used a different name there. That's because I decided to change the name on this series. It was previously known as Blast from the Past. However, Noble, as you may know if you are subscribed or watched any of his videos on his channel recently, that he also has a series pretty similar to this, where he basically just looks at the cars and tracks from the classic content on F1 2013, and he's named his series Blast from the Past. So basically, just to save any confusion, I decided to change the name to Old School instead. So yes, this is episode 2. We're going to be looking at the Williams FW07B, which is a 1980s car. It was driven by Carlos Reutemann and also Alan Jones, and Alan Jones went on to win the Drivers' Championship in 1980, and I believe Williams with this car also won the Constructors' Championship as well. The car itself had a Ford Cosworth DFV 3000 V8 naturally aspirated mid-mountain engine with a Hewland 5-speed manual gearbox. The car was actually designed by Patrick Head, and it took use of ground effect, so much so that in 1981 they actually removed the front wings as it produced that much downforce. But it's an unusual design, because if we get a nice shot, I think it's the next one coming up, you can actually see there's no rear diffuser. You can see underneath the car that the side pods are actually really quite high up, but the sides of the side pods come down really quite low. So there's an awful lot of airflow that actually runs under the underside of the car, and that's actually quite different to how we see F1 cars as of late, because obviously F1 cars use rear diffusers and obviously run as close and as low to the ground as possible, whereas this one pretty much has no diffuser, as you can see there again. However, there is an awful lot of room on the underside for all that airflow to go. But yes, we should take the car onto the track now. So like we did in the previous episode, we're going to start off with Jerez. We're then going to go to Estoril, and then Imola will follow with basically the hot lap. The car looks quite nice in the setup screen, although it's very, very flat sort of side pods. They're very straight. So it's not too bad looking car, although I'm not entirely sure about the very front of the car. The T-cam itself, as you can see here, is rather high up. I believe the camera is actually situated on top of the roll bar that just basically protects the driver's head from the open cockpit if it is to roll over. And you'll see when I switch to camera view and look at it from the side, so you can see the roll bar there on the top. The car is actually it's an interesting shape. It kind of looks like it's kind of got a triangular sort of base shape to it, with like a bit locked off the top. And yeah, like I said, the front, not too keen on the front wings. The side pods and everything are nice and bulky at the rear of the car. However, the front of the car looks very narrow and very bare and open. But I'm not too keen on that. So we're gonna get into a lap of Jerez now, and as you can see, we've got track IR enabled, and this will feature in pretty much every single cockpit cam thing that I do now, so now I'm starting to enjoy it that much. The rear view mirrors work quite nicely. They're better than the Ferrari. They still obstruct some of your view, but you can at least see kind of underneath the rear wing if the car is relatively close, and there is a little bit off to the side, so they're not brilliant, but they are better than the Ferrari. As for the car's handling itself, it's certainly not the fastest of all the classic content cars, especially from the 1980s. It's got some reasonable speed to it, and I think where it really makes up for its time is through the corners. It's got some very decent downforce. You can push relatively hard, and it doesn't step out on you too heavily either if you unless you really push and give it the full beans coming out on the exit of a corner. It's quite easy to be relatively smooth with the car. and if you treat it gently, it'll treat you gently back. So this is another one of those cars that I'd recommend to be using when you're just basically just trying to get used to the handling model. So that's La Jerez. We'll move on to Estoril now. And this is a track that I've kind of only really recently got into. I didn't really enjoy it all that much before, but driving in this car around the track, I enjoyed it a fair bit more. You can carry an awful lot of speed through a number of the corners. So coming down to turn 1, it's not quite flat out. I think the brake and shift down a bit. Yeah, ever so slight lift. And this second corner is completely flat out as well. And then this track is kind of very similar to Barcelona in kind of the layout. With, as you can see, first sector is very, very similar. Obviously, Barcelona has chicane at turn 1 and 2, rather than just a long right-hander or 2 right-handers. However, all this section through here is pretty much the same, and obviously you hear the wheels spinning up there as the car goes light over the bump, over the crest. But even still, not having to put a lot of oversteer or counter steer into the car to try and catch it. It's very well planted. This is using a default setup as well. Again, spinning that wheels ever so slightly. That's more just me turning more than the car wants to, and actually setting a very quick lap of Estoril in this. Yeah, 113, and I'm actually starting to enjoy driving this car a lot more. So this is a bit that you're interested in. Basically compare it to that Ferrari from the previous episode, and we're basically going to do a three lap hot lap like we did last time around Imola, and the time that we're looking to beat is a 1:27.950. As you can see up in the top right there, that is the time that I did set in the Ferrari. So we're going to be looking to try and smash that time by some reasonable margin. As you can see, taking the chicane really down quickly, balancing the throttle throughout the corners. Again, using first gear for this hairpin, grabbing an early second just to minimise the wheel spin coming out the exit of the corner. And coming up over the hill now to this relatively tricky left-hander. Kind of, you want to turn in, well, you feel like you want to turn in earlier than you should, and it often leads to turning in too early, firing it off. Onto the relatively difficult chicane. Now that one relatively easily. Coming basically down into the final section of the track. It's just this fast right-handed king, and then across the start-finish line. It doesn't look like we're going to be anywhere near the 127. Right, for this one, nope, it's a 1:29.3, so we're looking to gain over 1.3 seconds, as you can see. Could be quite some feat to do. Nonetheless, obviously, basically just building up the momentum as I go around each lap, pushing just that little bit harder, getting a real good feel for this car, and it does feel very nice indeed. It does a lot that you ask it to do. It does feel very, very planted, which is a nice relief. It makes up for that, the lack of power coming from the engine. Just like I said before in the previous episodes, I don't think it's as fast as the other 1980s cars. This car seems to be running at the back all the time when you're in an arcade race, or arcade race, Grand Prix race with the 1980s cars. But of course that doesn't mean it's it's a bad and boring car to drive. I actually enjoy driving this car quite a lot, just because of its stability. There we are, at 128.5, so already gained quite a bit of time, but we're still half a second off, so gonna really go for it in this lap, taking that chicane rather nicely, hitting those curbs, carrying and maximising as much speed as possible. Coming into this one, downshift a second, on the throttle pretty early, upshift, and then into the hairpin, running a little bit deep, but managing to bring it back for a late apex, and getting a good run out of that hairpin. Now for this fast left-hander, this is where I can really gain some time on the Ferrari lap, as the Ferrari lapper made a mistake in there, turned in too early. Through here, being relatively cautious, not so much on the throttle. On the brake I was relatively cautious, throttle I was giving it a bit, and with 2 tenths up on the fastest lap, so carrying through the chicane, taking that relatively nicely, trying not to cut it too much, coming down into this double left-hander, taking the first one relatively smooth and steady, balancing the throttle for the second, clipping those 2 curves beautifully. And coming out now into the braking zone. As you see, balancing the throttle, and we just about shy of it, 127.990. So that's actually going to conclude this episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Please give it a rating. If you have any comments or questions about the car, or if you've driven the car yourself, please let me know what you think of it as well. And of course, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, check out the 2 videos linked here with the track IR and also my in-depth track guide. That'll be very much appreciated. Otherwise, I hopefully see you soon, guys. Take care.